Some trails lead you to a destination, others lead you somewhere far darker. Evan loved the solitude of the mountains. Hiking had always been his escape from the noise and pressure of the city. The endless trails winding through towering pines offered a peace he couldn't find anywhere else. He had his favorite route, a challenging but rewarding loop that meandered through dense woods and offered breathtaking views from the summit. One crisp autumn morning, he set out early to enjoy the trail before it got busy. He parked his truck at the base, adjusted his pack, and started up the familiar path. The leaves were turning, painting the forest in hues of gold and crimson. A soft wind rustled the branches, and the distant chirping of birds accompanied his steps. Evan didn't see another soul during the first few miles. The isolation was exactly what he'd hoped for. But as he rounded a bend, he caught sight of a figure ahead. A woman, dressed in a hooded gray jacket, stood motionless on the path. Her back was to him, and she didn't move, even as he approached. "Morning?" Evan called out, his voice breaking the stillness. The woman didn't respond. She remained perfectly still, her hood pulled low. Evan slowed his pace, unsure of what to do. Maybe she hadn't heard him, or maybe she was lost. "Are you okay?" he asked, stepping closer. Finally, she turned. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking. There was something off about her gaze. It didn't quite meet his, as though she were looking past him. "Turn back," she said, her voice a raspy whisper. "Don't go up there." Evan blinked, startled. "Excuse me?" The woman's expression didn't change. "They don't like visitors." Before he could ask who they were, she turned and walked into the trees, vanishing between the trunks as if she'd never been there. Evan stood frozen for a moment, her warning echoing in his mind, but he shook it off. He wasn't one to be scared off by strange encounters. People said all sorts of weird things in the wilderness. He adjusted his pack and continued up the trail, though he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping over him. The higher Evan climbed, the quieter the forest became. The usual sounds of nature, chirping birds, rustling leaves, seemed to fade, replaced by an unnatural stillness. He kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see the woman again, but the path behind him was empty. After another mile, he reached a fork in the trail. The left path led to the summit, while the right descended into a narrow ravine. He had always taken the left path, but today, something compelled him to go right. Maybe it was curiosity or the lingering unease from his earlier encounter. The ravine was darker, the trees denser. The trail was barely visible, covered in fallen leaves. Evan felt a prickle of anxiety, but pushed forward. As he descended, he noticed strange marks on the trees, deep gashes, as though something sharp had torn into the bark. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, reaching for him. Then he heard it, a faint sound, like whispering, carried on the wind. It was too soft to make out the words, but it sent a chill down his spine. He paused, straining to listen, but the whispers stopped. Shaking his head, he told himself it was just the wind, and pressed on. The trail ended in a small clearing. At the center stood an old, crumbling stone structure, almost like a shrine. Moss and vines covered it, and the air around it felt heavy. Evan approached cautiously, his breath visible in the sudden cold. Carved into the stones were strange symbols, none of which he recognized. The whispers returned, louder now, as if coming from the stones themselves. He took a step back, heart pounding. Something about the place felt wrong, deeply wrong. "Turn back," a voice whispered behind him. He spun around, but no one was there. The clearing was empty. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift and writhe, and he realized with growing dread that he was no longer alone. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Evan backed away from the shrine, his eyes darting around the clearing. Then he saw them. Figures emerged from the shadows, their forms indistinct and shifting, as though made of smoke. Their eyes glowed faintly, and their movements were unnatural, jerky, yet fluid. Evan's instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs felt rooted to the ground. One of the figures raised an arm, pointing directly at him. "You shouldn't have come," it said, its voice layered with many others, as if a dozen people were speaking at once. Finally, his paralysis broke. He turned and bolted back up the trail, his heart pounding in his chest. The whispers followed him, growing louder and more chaotic, as if the forest itself was alive and angry. The trees seemed to close in, their branches clawing at him as he ran. He didn't stop until he burst out onto the main trail. The air was lighter here, the oppressive weight gone. He didn't look back, too terrified of what he might see. He ran all the way back to his truck, threw his pack into the bed, and sped away without a second glance. Evan never returned to that trail. He tried to research the symbols he'd seen on the shrine, but found nothing. The memory of the figures haunted him, their glowing eyes and distorted voices, a permanent fixture in his nightmares. He told himself it was just his imagination, that he'd let the strange woman's warning get into his head. But deep down, he knew the truth. Something was out there, something that didn't want to be found. Have you ever ignored a warning you shouldn't have? Share your story in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more chilling tales. Until next time, remember, not every path is meant to be walked.
When a stranger comes knocking in the dead of night, do you open the door or keep it shut? Winter storms in the northern mountains were no joke. The wind howled through the trees, sending snow whipping against the windows of Alex's remote cabin. He had come here to write, to escape the chaos of city life and find inspiration in the solitude. It was perfect until that night. The snowstorm had been raging since dusk, and by midnight, Alex had given up trying to focus on his work. He put another log on the fire and settled into the worn armchair by the hearth, a mug of tea warming his hands. The glow of the flames was comforting, a barrier against the icy darkness outside. Just as he was starting to doze off, there was a loud knock at the door. Alex froze. Who would be out here in weather like this? The cabin was miles from the nearest town, and the storm made travel nearly impossible. Another knock came, louder this time. He set his mug down and approached the door cautiously. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady despite the unease creeping over him. "Please," a man's voice replied, muffled by the wind. "I'm lost. Let me in. It's freezing out here." Alex hesitated. He glanced through the peephole, but could see only darkness and swirling snow. Something about the man's voice sounded off, but he couldn't place why. "Are you alone?" Alex asked. A pause. "Yes. Please. I'm freezing." His gut told him to keep the door shut, but he couldn't just leave someone to freeze to death. After a moment's deliberation, Alex unlocked the door and opened it a crack. A man stood there, shivering violently, his face pale and windburned. His coat was torn, and his eyes darted nervously around the cabin's interior. "Thank you," the man said, stepping inside before Alex could fully open the door. The stranger collapsed into the armchair by the fire, rubbing his hands together. Alex shut the door, locking it again, and watched the man warily. Something about him didn't feel right. "What are you doing out here?" Alex asked. "Got caught in the storm," the man replied, not meeting Alex's eyes. "My car broke down. Thought I'd freeze to death out there." Alex nodded, though his instincts were screaming that the man's story didn't add up. "There's a spare blanket in the bedroom. I'll grab it for you." As Alex turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of the man's reflection in the window. The stranger wasn't looking at the fire. He was watching Alex, his expression dark and calculating. Alex's nerves were on edge as he retrieved the blanket. He returned to the living room to find the man still sitting by the fire, but his demeanor had changed. His shivering had stopped, and his gaze was fixed on Alex with unsettling intensity. "Thanks," the man said, taking the blanket without breaking eye contact. "You live here alone?" Alex's grip on the blanket tightened. "Yeah, just me." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Must get pretty lonely out here." Alex forced a chuckle. "It's peaceful." The man's smile widened. "You're lucky. Most people don't know what it's like to be truly alone." A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, and Alex felt the temperature in the room drop. He glanced toward the door, his unease growing. Something about this man, the way he spoke, the way he moved, felt wrong, like he didn't belong. "Do you need to use the phone?" Alex asked, hoping to end the interaction. The man's expression shifted, his smile fading. "No," he said flatly. I'll stay here tonight. Alex's heart pounded. I'm sorry, but I can't. You can, the man interrupted, his tone sharp. It's not like you have a choice. Before Alex could respond, the power went out. The fire's glow was the only light in the cabin, casting flickering shadows across the walls. The man stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. You shouldn't have opened the door, the man said, his voice now low and menacing. Alex backed away, his mind racing. I think you should leave, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. The man laughed, a cold, hollow sound. Oh, I'm not going anywhere. As he stepped closer, Alex grabbed the fire poker from the hearth. Stay back, he warned, his voice trembling. The man stopped, his head tilting to the side as if considering Alex's threat. Then, without warning, he lunged. Alex swung the poker, the metal connecting with a sickening thud. The man stumbled but didn't go down. His movements were unnatural, almost inhuman. Alex ran for the bedroom, slamming the door behind him. He pressed his back against it, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Outside, the storm howled, and he could hear the man's heavy footsteps approaching. You can't hide, the man taunted, his voice now a guttural growl. You let me in. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening, and Alex strained to hear any sign of movement. Then the door burst open, and the man stood there, his eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The storm passed by morning, but the cabin was empty. Alex's truck was still parked outside, untouched. Neighbors found the door ajar, the interior covered in claw marks and ashes scattered near the hearth. Of Alex, there was no sign. Some said he got lost in the storm, while others whispered darker theories. One thing was certain, no one stayed in that cabin again. Locals said it was cursed, haunted by the man Alex had let in. What would you have done if someone knocked on your door in the middle of a storm? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more chilling tales. Stay safe, and remember, not every knock deserves an answer.
Some cries for help aren't what they seem, and answering them might cost you everything. A storm was tearing through the town of Ashwood that night, a ferocious tempest that rattled the windows and drowned the streets in rain. Amelia sat curled up in her living room, a book balanced on her lap, and a cup of tea steaming on the table beside her. The flickering light of the television added to the cozy atmosphere, contrasting sharply with the chaos outside. Her parents, Marla and Rick, were in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner, their voices a faint murmur over the sound of the storm. Upstairs, her younger brother Tyler was undoubtedly glued to his video games, headphones blocking out the world. Amelia loved storms like this. They made her feel alive, a thrilling reminder of nature's power. But that comfort shattered when an ear-splitting bang reverberated through the house. She jolted upright, her heart racing. The sound had come from the window behind her. Slowly, Amelia turned her head. Rain streaked the glass, distorting the view outside, but she could just make out a figure. A man, pale and wild-eyed, hammering at the window with his fists. He was screaming, but the storm muffled his words. Fear rooted her in place. The man's face was desperate, his movements frantic. Summoning her courage, Amelia cracked the window open, just enough to hear him over the rain. "Please, let me in," he begged, his voice hoarse and trembling. "I'm hurt. They're after me." Amelia hesitated. There was blood on his shirt, streaked across his chest, and he clutched his side as if nursing a wound. The rational part of her mind screamed to shut the window and call the police, but his terror was infectious. "Who's after you?" she demanded, her voice shaky. "No time, please," he shouted, pounding the glass again. "They're coming!" Amelia's parents appeared in the doorway, alarm etched on their faces. Rick immediately took charge. "What's going on?" he asked, striding toward the window. "There's a man out there," Amelia stammered. "He says he's hurt, and someone's after him." Rick peered through the rain-streaked glass. The man's pleas grew more frantic. "We have to let him in," Marla said. though her voice wavered with uncertainty. But Rick hesitated. "We don't know who he is," he said, "or what he's running from." Before they could decide, the phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the tension. Marla grabbed it, her face paling as she listened to the caller. When she hung up, her voice was barely above a whisper. "That was the Bennetts next door. They said there's someone dangerous on the loose. He's been breaking into houses." The man outside banged on the window again, harder this time. "You're making a mistake," he screamed. "Please!" Rick backed away, shaking his head. "We're calling the police. That's it." He pulled out his phone and dialed, but the man outside grew more desperate. He began slamming his shoulder into the window, his bloodied face twisted with fury. "Don't you understand?" he yelled. "If you don't let me in, they'll kill me." The glass shuddered under his weight. Amelia's stomach churned with fear and doubt. Was he lying? Or was there truly something worse out there, hunting him? The sound of sirens wailed faintly in the distance, growing louder as the minutes dragged on. Rick stood at the door, armed with a baseball bat, while Marla hovered near Amelia, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. They all watched as the man outside staggered backward, his shoulders slumping in defeat. For a moment, it seemed like he might give up. But then Amelia spotted something beyond him, a shadowy figure moving through the storm, her breath caught in her throat. "Dad," she whispered, "there's someone else out there." Rick turned, his eyes narrowing as he squinted through the rain. The figure drew closer, and then another appeared, and another. 3 people dressed in dark clothing and moving with a predatory grace emerged from the shadows. The man at the window saw them too. His eyes widened in terror. "You see?" he cried. "They're here. Please, I'm begging you." Marla gasped. "Oh my God. Rick, do something." But Rick was frozen, torn between protecting his family and the possibility that they might be letting a threat into their home. The figures outside moved closer, their faces obscured by the rain. One of them raised something, a crowbar, and smashed it against the side of the house. The sound reverberated like a gunshot. Panic erupted. Rick yelled for everyone to get back. The man at the window pounded harder, blood smearing the glass. "Let me in. They'll kill us all." Amelia made a split-second decision. She grabbed the latch and threw open the window. The man scrambled inside, collapsing onto the floor. Rick slammed the window shut just as one of the intruders reached it, their face inches from the glass. It was a woman, her eyes cold and feral. She snarled, her breath fogging the window. "You shouldn't have done that," she hissed, her voice muffled but chilling. The intruders didn't leave. They circled the house like wolves, testing doors and windows, their dark silhouettes haunting every corner of the home. The man, still clutching his side, looked up at Amelia with gratitude and fear. "You saved my life," he said, his voice weak. "Who are they?" she demanded. "Bad people," he said. "I got away from them. They want me dead because I know too much." Rick wasn't buying it. "And how do we know you're not one of them?" "Because they're trying to kill me," the man snapped. The power flickered, then went out, plunging the house into darkness. The only light came from the occasional flash of lightning, illuminating the intruders as they continued their siege. Amelia's heart pounded in her chest as she huddled with her family and the stranger in the living room. Then came the sound of glass shattering. One of them had broken in. Rick swung his bat as a dark figure lunged into the room, knocking over a lamp. The stranger pulled a knife from his pocket and joined the fray, fighting with the desperation of a man with nothing to lose. Chaos erupted as the intruders swarmed the house, but the wail of sirens grew louder and closer. The police arrived just in time. Flashlights and shouted commands filled the air as the intruders scattered into the storm. 2 were caught, the third disappearing into the night. The man slumped against the wall, his shirt soaked with blood, but his expression one of relief. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the house in shambles, but the family safe. The man, who introduced himself as Eric, was taken to the hospital under police custody. It turned out he had been involved in a criminal operation, but he had turned informant and was on the run from his former associates. Amelia couldn't shake the image of those intruders, their predatory movements and chilling eyes. She knew she'd never feel entirely safe again, not in Ashwood, not anywhere. What would you have done in Amelia's place? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Stay safe out there. You never know who might be watching.
They told me the countryside was safe, but no one warned me that not all shadows stay where they belong. When Dana moved to a rural town to escape the stress of city life, she never imagined her peaceful new existence would take such a dark turn. The village of Elmstead was quaint, with its cobblestone streets and friendly locals. Her new home, a small cottage at the edge of a sprawling forest, seemed like the perfect place to reset her life. The first few weeks were idyllic. Each evening, Dana would take her golden retriever, Max, for a walk along the winding trails that meandered through the woods. The forest was quiet, the air crisp, and the only sounds were the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of leaves in the breeze. She felt free for the first time in years. One Thursday evening, after a long day of work, Dana decided to take a later-than-usual walk. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and purple. As she grabbed Max's leash, she noticed how still the evening felt. Too still. Shaking off her unease, she stepped out onto the trail. The path was cloaked in shadows, but Dana found comfort in the rhythmic crunch of her boots on the gravel and Max's cheerful panting. She passed by the familiar landmarks, the old wooden bench, the gnarled oak tree, and the small clearing where wildflowers bloomed in the spring. Yet, as she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. A sudden rustling sound came from behind her. She froze, her heart pounding. Max's ears perked up, and he let out a low growl. Turning slowly, Dana scanned the path. Nothing, just the trees swaying gently in the wind. "Come on, Max," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Let's keep moving." They continued, but the feeling of unease grew stronger. A few minutes later, Dana heard it again, the distinct sound of footsteps, light and deliberate. They seemed to echo her own, stopping when she stopped, quickening when she quickened. She spun around, her breath hitching in her throat. The path behind her was empty, but the shadows between the trees seemed darker, more menacing. "Hello?" she called out, her voice firm. No response. Max growled again, his hackles raised. Dana's grip tightened on his leash as she picked up her pace. When they reached a small wooden bridge that spanned a trickling creek, Dana's phone buzzed in her pocket. She fumbled to answer it, grateful for the distraction. It was Claire, her best friend from the city. "Hey, Claire," Dana said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You okay?" "You sound a little off," Claire replied. "I'm fine, just out walking Max. The woods are a bit creepy tonight." "Creepy? Come on, you moved there to get away from creepy," Claire joked. Dana managed a weak laugh. "Yeah, I know. I'll call you when I get back home." As she hung up, Dana noticed Max staring intently at the end of the bridge. Following his gaze, she saw a figure standing just beyond the tree line. It was a man, tall and hunched, his face obscured by a hood. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, watching her. "Who's there?" Dana shouted, her voice shaking. The man didn't respond. Instead, he took a step closer. Panic surged through Dana. She turned and bolted back the way she came, Max keeping pace beside her. The sound of footsteps behind her grew louder, faster. He was following her. Dana's lungs burned as she ran, her mind racing. The shadows of the forest seemed to close in around her, the once familiar trail now a twisting maze. She risked a glance over her shoulder and saw the man, now much closer, his hood flapping in the wind as he sprinted after her. Finally, she spotted the faint glow of her cottage's porch light through the trees. Summoning every ounce of strength, Dana sprinted the final stretch, nearly tripping on the uneven ground. She stumbled up the steps, fumbled with her keys, and shoved the door open just as the man reached the edge of her yard. Slamming the door shut, Dana locked it and collapsed against it, gasping for breath. Max barked furiously, scratching at the door. Peering through the peephole, Dana saw the man standing at the foot of her steps, his hood now pulled back to reveal a gaunt, pale face. His eyes were hollow, filled with something dark and unsettling. He smiled, a slow, chilling grin that sent a shiver down her spine. He raised a hand and pointed at her door, then turned and disappeared into the shadows. Dana didn't sleep that night. Every creak and groan of the old cottage set her nerves on edge. She called the local sheriff's office, but by the time a deputy arrived, the man was long gone. "Probably just a drifter," the deputy said, though his tone lacked conviction. "I'll have someone patrol the area tonight." But Dana knew it wasn't just a drifter. There was something about the way he had looked at her, something that felt deeply wrong. She spent the next few days jumpy and on edge, keeping Max close and avoiding the woods entirely. One evening, as she was locking up for the night, Dana heard a soft tapping on the window. Her heart leapt into her throat. Slowly she turned to see a piece of paper pressed against the glass, held by a pale hand. The paper had a single word scrawled on it: "Run." When she flung open the curtain, there was no one there, just the dark forest, silent and waiting. If you think you know who was haunting Dana's path, leave your theory in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that'll keep you up at night. Until next time, stay safe and stay in the light.
Sometimes the scariest things aren't what you see. They're what you hear. When Emma was 9 years old, her family moved into an old farmhouse on the outskirts of a small town. The house, built in the late 1800s, was charming, but creaked and groaned with the weight of its history. Emma loved her new home, especially the sprawling backyard and the creek that ran through it. But there was one place she avoided at all costs: the basement. The basement was dark, musty, and cluttered with generations of forgotten belongings. The single light bulb hanging from the ceiling barely illuminated the room, leaving shadows to loom in every corner. Her mother used it as storage, and her father joked that it was where monsters hid to scare little kids. Emma didn't laugh. One evening, while watching cartoons in the living room, Emma heard her mother calling her name. "Emma, come help me downstairs," the voice called. She glanced toward the kitchen where her mother was supposed to be making dinner, but the sound had come from the basement door. "Coming," Emma shouted back, though her stomach churned with unease. She hated going down there, but she didn't want to disobey. She opened the basement door, her hand trembling on the knob. The stairs groaned under her weight as she descended, the light switch clicking on but barely cutting through the darkness. "Mum!" she called out, peering into the cluttered space. There was no response. Her heart began to race. She stepped further into the basement, scanning the room for her mother, but the space was empty. "Mum!" she called again, louder this time. Then she heard it, a faint, muffled voice from the far corner of the basement. "Emma," it whispered, drawn out and eerie. She froze. The voice was unmistakably her mother's, but it sounded wrong, hollow, like it was coming from a great distance. She backed toward the stairs, her breath quickening. Just as she reached the bottom step, she heard footsteps, but not from the basement. They came from above her, in the kitchen. Then her mother's voice again, clear and cheerful. "Emma, dinner's ready." Her blood turned to ice. If her mother was upstairs, then who or what had called her down. Emma bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind her. Her mother stood at the stove, humming to herself, entirely unaware of Emma's panic. "What's wrong, honey?" she asked, turning to look at her pale-faced daughter. "You called me to the basement," Emma said, her voice trembling. Her mother frowned. "No, I didn't. I've been up here the whole time." Emma's father walked in, laughing. "You probably just imagined it. That old basement makes noises all the time." But Emma knew what she had heard. That night, she couldn't sleep. The memory of the voice echoed in her mind, each repetition making her more certain that it hadn't been her imagination. Around midnight, she heard a faint creak outside her bedroom door. She sat up, her heart pounding. "Emma," a voice whispered from the hallway. It was her mother's voice again, but softer, more insistent. She slid out of bed and tiptoed to the door, cracking it open just enough to peek into the hallway. It was empty. "Emma," the voice came again, now from downstairs. Fear gripped her, but curiosity won out. She crept down the stairs, her bare feet silent against the wooden steps. The voice led her to the basement door. She reached for the knob, hesitating for a moment before opening it. The darkness below seemed deeper than usual, as if the shadows were alive. "Emma!" the voice called again, louder now. She flipped the light switch, but the bulb didn't turn on. Clutching the railing, she stepped down into the darkness. The air felt heavier, colder. The voice called her name once more, this time from the very back of the basement. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice shaking. Something moved in the shadows. A figure stepped forward, just enough for her to see its outline. It was tall and thin, with impossibly long arms. Its face was obscured, but it tilted its head as if studying her. "Emma!" it said again, the voice now distorted, a mockery of her mother's tone. She screamed and scrambled back up the stairs, slamming the door shut and locking it. Her parents rushed out of their bedroom, alarmed by her cries. Through sobs, she told them what she had seen. Her father checked the basement but found nothing. "There's nothing down there," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "It's just your imagination." But Emma knew it wasn't. The thing in the basement was real, and it was watching her. Over the next few weeks, Emma avoided the basement entirely, but the voice didn't stop. It called to her at odd hours, sometimes from the basement, sometimes from outside her window. Her parents dismissed it as nightmares, but Emma knew better. One night, the voice grew bolder. As Emma lay in bed, she heard it again, but this time it wasn't calling her name. It was speaking to someone else. "She's scared. She knows we're here," it whispered. Emma's blood ran cold. Who was it talking to? Summoning her courage, she grabbed a flashlight and crept downstairs. The house was silent, but she felt the presence of something waiting. She opened the basement door, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was thick, oppressive. Then she saw it. The figure was standing in the center of the room, but it wasn't alone. Dozens of smaller shapes writhed in the shadows, their movements jerky and unnatural. The tall figure turned to face her, its eyeless gaze locking onto hers. "Emma," it said, stepping closer. "You shouldn't have come." She screamed and fled up the stairs, slamming the door behind her. But this time the door didn't hold. It burst open, and the shadows spilled into the house. Her parents woke to chaos, the walls shaking as if the house itself were alive. The figures surrounded them, their distorted voices filling the air. Just as Emma thought it was over, the first rays of dawn broke through the windows. The figures recoiled, hissing as the light touched them. Within moments they were gone, leaving the house in silence. The family moved out the next day, leaving the farmhouse and its horrors behind. Years later, Emma still hears the voice in her dreams, calling her back to the basement. She never answers. What would you have done if you were Emma? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Stay safe and remember, not every voice deserves an answer.
Some basements hold more than just dust and shadows. Sometimes, they hold secrets that refuse to stay buried. Jenna had always hated basements. They were dark, damp, and full of strange noises that her imagination loved to twist into something sinister. So, when she and her partner, Naomi, bought their first house together, Jenna was less than thrilled about the sprawling, unfinished basement beneath it. It's perfect for storage, Naomi had said, standing at the top of the stairs during their first walkthrough. It's perfect for nightmares, Jenna had muttered under her breath, but Naomi had laughed and brushed it off. For the first few months, Jenna avoided the basement entirely. Naomi handled everything down there, cleaning, organizing, even setting up a small workshop in one corner. But one evening, while Naomi was working late, Jenna found herself staring at the basement door with a sinking feeling. She needed to grab a box of winter clothes stored down there. The weather had turned unexpectedly cold, and the heavy coats were buried somewhere in the basement's maze of shelves and plastic bins. It's just a basement, she told herself. Nothing to be scared of. Still, her hand trembled as she turned the knob and flipped the light switch. The bulb at the bottom of the stairs flickered weakly, casting long, shifting shadows. Taking a deep breath, Jenna descended, her footsteps echoing on the wooden stairs. The air was colder down there, and the faint smell of damp earth clung to everything. Jenna scanned the shelves, trying to remember where Naomi had stored the winter clothes. She found herself stepping deeper into the basement, her unease growing with every creak of the floorboards above her. As she reached the back corner, something caught her eye. A small, square window near the ceiling, half covered with dirt from outside, reflected the dim light in an odd way. She thought she saw movement, a shadow passing in front of it, but when she looked closer, it was still. Just my imagination, she muttered. She finally spotted the box she needed on the highest shelf. Grumbling, she dragged over a wobbly step stool and climbed up. As she reached for the box, a soft noise froze her in place. It was faint but unmistakable, the sound of breathing. Her heart thundered in her chest. "Naomi," she called out, her voice shaky. No answer. The breathing grew louder, closer, as if it were right behind her. Jenna whipped around, nearly toppling off the stool. The basement was empty. The only sound now was her own ragged breathing. Grabbing the box, she stumbled off the stool and hurried back toward the stairs. But as she reached the bottom step, the basement door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Jenna's scream caught in her throat. She raced up the stairs, pounding on the door. "Naomi? Naomi, are you there?" There was no response. She tried the knob, but it wouldn't budge. The air in the basement grew heavier, colder, and Jenna felt a presence behind her. She turned slowly, dread pooling in her stomach. At first, she saw nothing, but then, in the corner near the window, a figure began to take shape. It was tall and gaunt, its body draped in tattered shadows that seemed to writhe and shift. Its face was obscured, but its eyes, dark and bottomless, fixed on her with an intensity that made her legs weaken. "You shouldn't be here," the figure whispered, its voice a rasp that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Jenna backed against the door, fumbling for her phone. Her fingers shook so badly, she could barely unlock it. Just as she managed to pull up the flashlight app, the figure lunged. The light from her phone hit the creature, and it recoiled with a piercing shriek. Jenna took the opportunity to slam her shoulder against the door, again and again, until it finally gave way. She stumbled into the kitchen, slamming the door shut behind her and locking it. The house was silent, too silent. Jenna backed away from the door, clutching her phone like a lifeline. She could still hear the creature's shriek echoing in her ears. When Naomi came home later that night, she found Jenna curled up on the couch, every light in the house turned on. Jenna tried to explain what had happened, but Naomi looked skeptical. "There's nothing in the basement," Naomi said gently. "I'll check it out in the morning." Naomi's inspection turned up nothing unusual, but Jenna refused to go back down there. She insisted they sell the house, even if it meant taking a loss. Naomi reluctantly agreed, though she still believed it was just Jenna's imagination. The new owners moved in a month later. On their first night, they heard a faint knocking sound coming from the basement. When they went to investigate, they found the basement door locked tight from the inside. What would you have done in Jenna's shoes? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales that will keep you awake at night. Until next time, stay safe and stay out of the basement.